Chapter 4. The Partner's Dilemma. The heat hit Jake like a physical blow the moment they stepped off the plane in Darwin. After the cool autumn air of Melbourne, the tropical humidity felt suffocating. Sweat was already beading on his forehead as he followed Sarah through the small terminal, both of them keeping their heads down and sunglasses on. "Remind me again why Arthur hid evidence in the middle of nowhere," Jake muttered, shouldering his backpack. Sarah checked her phone, scanning for any news about their manhunt status. Because nowhere is exactly where corrupt cops don't want to look. Arthur was smart. He spread the evidence across the continent, in places where city officials would stand out like sore thumbs. They'd driven through the night from Melbourne, abandoning the motorcycle in Adelaide and catching the first flight north under fake IDs that Sarah had produced from her seemingly endless supply of resources. Jake was beginning to understand that his great-uncle's illegitimate daughter had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life. The third condition, according to Arthur's journal, was cryptified where the old tracker kept the government's promises, and William will show you the way to truth. But Sarah had done her research during the flight. William Japarra was an Aboriginal tracker who worked with the federal police in the 1980s, she explained, as they climbed into a rental car. Arthur trusted him with something important after the gold heist went wrong. But according to my contacts, William died 3 days ago. Jake felt his stomach drop. 3 days ago? That's not a coincidence. Nothing about this inheritance is a coincidence. Sarah started the engine and pulled out of the airport parking lot. Someone's been systematically eliminating everyone connected to Arthur's evidence. First, Jeffrey Whitmore. Now William. We need to find William's family before whoever killed him finds them too. The drive from Darwin to the remote Aboriginal community took them deep into the Northern Territory's red heart. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, endless stretches of red dirt, scattered termite mounds, and sparse vegetation that somehow managed to survive in the brutal heat. Jake had never felt so far from civilization. There, Sarah pointed to a cluster of modest houses and community buildings in the distance. Mgakur community. Population about 1,200, mostly indigenous families who've lived on this land for thousands of years. As they drove into the community, Jake noticed they were attracting attention. Children stopped playing to stare at their rental car. Adults emerged from houses, their expressions wary. Word traveled fast in small communities, and strangers, especially white strangers, were noticed immediately. Sarah parked outside what looked like a community center. "Let me do the talking initially. These people have good reason not to trust outsiders, especially ones connected to government officials." They were approached by a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple dress and had the kind of presence that suggested authority in the community. "You looking for someone?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "We're here about William Japarra," Sarah said respectfully. "We understand he passed away recently. We're very sorry for your loss." The woman's expression hardened. "William's family isn't talking to anyone, especially not people from the city asking questions about government business." "Please," Jake stepped forward. "I know this sounds strange, but William was protecting something for my family. Something that could bring justice for a lot of people who've been hurt." "Your family?" The woman looked Jake up and down, her eyes sharp. "What's your name, young man?" "Jake Mitchell." The effect was immediate. The woman's face went pale, and several other community members who'd been listening stepped back. "Mitchell," she repeated, her voice cold. "You've got some nerve coming here." "I don't understand. Your people brought death to this place. William was murdered because of whatever your family got him involved in 40 years ago. And now you show up the day after we bury him, wanting more." Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "William was murdered because of my family. 3 men came here a week ago, asking the same questions you're asking. Said they were federal police, but William knew better. He sent them away, but they came back. Found his body in the creek 2 days later." Sarah stepped closer to Jake, her hand moving subtly toward the concealed weapon under her jacket. "These 3 men? Did they have a leader? Someone older, maybe with authority?" The woman's eyes flicked to Sarah's movement. She'd noticed the weapon. "Detective Inspector Reynolds. Showed us his badge, acted all official." But William saw through him immediately. Jake's blood ran cold. Reynolds had been here. The corrupt cop was following their trail, eliminating witnesses as he went. "William's grandson Tommy might talk to you," The woman continued reluctantly. He's angry about what happened, and he blames your family for bringing this curse to our people. But he also knows William died protecting something important. Where can we find Tommy? Down by the river. But I warn you, he's not in a talking mood. And if you're lying about bringing justice, if you're just here to cover up more government secrets, you'll know. The river was actually a muddy creek that wound through the red landscape like a brown snake. Jake and Sarah found Tommy Japarra sitting on a fallen log, staring out at the water. He was probably in his mid-20s, with the lean build of someone who spent his life outdoors. His dark eyes held a mixture of grief and barely contained rage. "You're the Mitchell boy," he said, without looking up as they approached. "Thought you might show up eventually." Jake sat down carefully on another log, keeping his distance. "I'm sorry about your grandfather. I never knew him, but from what I've heard, he was a good man." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "Good man who got involved with the wrong people. Your great-uncle Arthur came here in 1985, scared and desperate, asking my grandfather to hide something for him. Said it was evidence that would bring down corrupt cops and politicians." "Did your grandfather hide it?" "Course he did. William believed in justice, even when justice didn't believe in him." Tommy finally looked at Jake, his eyes blazing. "But Arthur never came back. 40 years my grandfather kept that secret, waiting for someone from your family to claim it. 40 years of looking over his shoulder, wondering when the wrong people would figure out what he knew." Sarah leaned forward. "Tommy, those wrong people finally found him. Detective Inspector Reynolds and his team killed William because they're desperate to bury the truth. But if we can find Arthur's evidence, we can what? Bring William back from the dead." Tommy stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. "You people don't get it. This isn't some adventure story where the good guys win in the end. This is real life, where corrupt cops murder Aboriginal elders and no one gives a damn." Jake felt the weight of his family's legacy crushing down on him. Everything Arthur had done to expose the truth had only caused more pain, more death. Maybe it would be better to walk away, to let the inheritance and its deadly conditions die with him. But then he thought about his father, murdered for wanting to do the right thing. About Jeffrey Whitmore, shot in his office for helping Jake. About William, killed for keeping a 40-year-old promise. "You're right," Jake said quietly. "We can't bring anyone back. But we can make sure they didn't die for nothing." Tommy studied Jake's face for a long moment. "William left me instructions. Said if anything happened to him, I should give Arthur's evidence to a Mitchell family member, but only if they proved they were willing to sacrifice everything for justice." "What kind of proof?" Before Tommy could answer, Sarah's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. She checked it and went pale. "We've got company. 3 vehicles approaching from the main road, moving fast." Tommy was already moving. "Reynolds. He must have been watching the community, waiting to see if you'd show up." He looked at Jake with new respect. "Looks like you're about to get that chance to prove yourself." They could hear the vehicles now, the roar of powerful engines cutting through the afternoon quiet. Tommy led them away from the river, following a path that wound through scrubland toward a series of rocky outcroppings. "William hid Arthur's evidence in a sacred site," Tommy explained as they climbed. "Somewhere outsiders would never think to look, and somewhere my people would protect with their lives." Behind them, car doors slammed. Voices shouted orders. Jake could hear Reynolds coordinating his team, spreading them out to surround the area. "There." Sarah pointed to a narrow gap between 2 massive rocks. "We can get through there." But as they squeezed through the gap, they found themselves in a natural amphitheater surrounded by ancient rock paintings. The Aboriginal art covered every surface, thousands of years of stories told in ochre and charcoal, depicting everything from hunting scenes to spiritual ceremony. "This is it," Tommy said, his voice filled with reverence. "William's hiding place." He led them to a particular section of rock art, where newer paintings had been added over the old. Hidden among the traditional motifs was a modern addition, a small symbol that looked like a key. Tommy pressed his hand against the symbol, and Jake heard a subtle click. A section of the rock face swung inward, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside was a metal document tube, protected by layers of waterproof material. Tommy pulled it out and handed it to Jake. 40 years of secrets, he said. William died protecting this. Jake opened the tube with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, documents, and audio recordings that detailed the entire 1985 corruption network. Names, dates, bank account numbers, recorded conversations between high-ranking officials and criminal organizations. It was everything Arthur had promised. Enough evidence to bring down dozens of corrupt officials and expose a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades. But mixed in with the government documents were newer additions, recent photographs, surveillance reports, and financial records, showing that the corruption network was still active, still growing, still eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. "My God," Sarah breathed, looking over Jake's shoulder. "This goes all the way to the current federal government. Ministers, judges, police commissioners, they're all involved. That's why they'll never stop hunting us," Tommy said grimly. "This evidence could bring down the entire system." Voices echoed off the rock walls. Reynolds and his team had found the entrance to the sacred site. "This way," Tommy whispered, leading them toward what looked like solid rock. But as they got closer, Jake could see it was actually a narrow passage, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. They squeezed through the passage just as armed figures appeared at the main entrance. Jake could hear Reynolds shouting orders, his voice echoing strangely in the ancient amphitheater. The passage led to another opening higher up the rock formation, providing a clear view of the community below. Jake could see more vehicles arriving. Reynolds had brought an entire team of corrupt cops, all armed and all desperate to recover Arthur's evidence. "We're trapped," Sarah said, checking her weapon. "Too many of them, and they know we're up here." Tommy was studying the landscape with the trained eye of someone who'd grown up in this country. "Not trapped. There's a way down the back of these rocks, but it's dangerous. One wrong step and you'll fall 100 feet. Better than letting Reynolds get this evidence," Jake said, tucking the document tube securely in his backpack. As they began their precarious descent down the back of the rock formation, Jake realized that the inheritance conditions had fundamentally changed. 3 days ago, he'd been a simple carpenter who'd never been in a real fight. Now he was a fugitive carrying evidence that could topple governments, trusting his life to an indigenous tracker who had every reason to let him fall. "My people have survived a lot worse than corrupt cops. Right now, the most important thing is getting that evidence to safety." As they drove away from the poor community, kicking up a cloud of red dust, Jake realized they'd passed a point of no return. They had Arthur's evidence, but Reynolds knew they hadn't. The chase was about to become a continent-wide manhunt, and nowhere in Australia would be safe. But they also had something Reynolds didn't expect: an Aboriginal tracker who knew this country better than any corrupt city cop, and 40 years' worth of evidence that could finally bring justice to the people who destroyed so many lives. The fourth condition was complete, but the real test was just beginning.